Good to
Good
go.
afternoon, everyone. It is a beautiful Tuesday afternoon, which we are certainly thankful for after the storms that have rolled through over the past couple of days. I was telling Alan just a few moments ago, texted my wife earlier, that Pleasant Plains extended the road that the church house is on. Looks like a war zone. There were just trees down everywhere. Right at the intersection of one of the major roads here that connects to this road, there is a tree that very clearly was struck by lightning. The whole top of it has just been blown off, and it's all black and burned from lightning. It has certainly been crazy here in West Tennessee and in other places of the country. Let's be prayerful for one another, for any of those who might have been affected by the weather, and let's definitely be praising God for the deliverance through the bad weather that we have. We certainly can deal with a little bit of a power outage, as long as nothing gets a little crazier beyond that. But Alan, good to see you this afternoon. Hope you're doing well.
Doing good. Happy to be here.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Well, Alan, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 18 and 19 today. We're going to be talking about the visitors that Abraham has as we find him in the land of the oaks of Mamre. And we're going to talk about the well-known story of Sodom and Gomorrah. These two chapters being side by side to us might not seem all that connected at all. We're going to see at least one theme here we find between these two chapters is a theme of hospitality. We see that playing in a little bit within these texts. We'll talk about that here as we get into it. Genesis 18 and 19, again, is where we are today. If you're joining us, we invite you to join us in your Bibles, or we'll have the text here on the screen if you would like to join along with us as we read through the text and discuss what is found there within. All right, Alan, you want to begin reading for us here in Genesis 18 as we continue going on in the story of Abraham?
Yeah, we'll start off. Let's just, I guess, go ahead and read maybe the first 8 verses or so, and kind of introduce these two chapters really tie together in one narrative. So we'll introduce this section. Chapter 18, verse 1: The Lord appeared to Abraham at the oaks of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent during the heat of the day. He looked up and he saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to meet them, bowed to the ground, and said, "My Lord, if I have found favor with you, please do not go on past your servant. Let a little water be brought, that you may wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. I will bring a bit of bread so that you may strengthen yourselves. This is why you have passed your servant's way. Later, you can continue on." "Yes," they replied, "do as you have said." So Abraham hurried into the tent and said to Sarah, "Quick, knead 3 measures of fine flour and make bread." Abraham ran to the herd and got a tender, choice calf. He gave it to a young man who hurried to prepare it. Then Abraham took curds and milk, as well as the calf that he had prepared, and set them before the men. He served them as they ate under the tree.
All righty. Thank you, Alan. So we have here an instance of Abraham just seemingly going about his day, a regular day in his home where he is residing, when all of a sudden there are 3 men who are standing before him, and his instant reaction to this is to extend hospitality. This is something that I noticed as I read through this text, both in Genesis 18 and Genesis 19, this idea and theme of hospitality and how it is that we respond to strangers who we have the opportunity to serve. And Abraham here in this text, what we're able to notice as we look through this text is to recognize the divine nature of these guests. And somebody who's reading it at face value might say, well, this is something that Abraham noticed as well, because he says here in this text, he refers to them as my Lord. And yet, I think it would be more appropriate to recognize that this is not a moniker of giving divine, recognizing somebody as being divine, but this is simply a term of courtesy. It is the word Adonai, which is the same word that's going to be used later on in the text in verse number 12, whenever Sarah talks about Abraham being her Lord, my Lord, the same word Adonai. But I just want to note here, Alan, you might have something to add to this. How is it that Abraham whenever he first meets these people, he says, here, I'm going to do this for you. But then that quickly kind of shifts into becoming a little bit something more. You want to speak to that for a moment?
I definitely agree with what you said about my Lord. I think at this point, Abraham doesn't realize who he's talking with. I mean, if God appears to you, God doesn't need food, so that would be kind of useless to offer him all this food. I think this is the key is just the level of hospitality and respect and care for one's neighbor that Abraham's showing here. And notice how he does it here. He just says, he's talking to the men. He says in verse 4, let a little water be brought. Let me wash your feet, rest yourselves. I will bring a bit of bread so that you may strengthen. He's using these kind of, just like, oh, this is no big deal. Let me do a little bit. Let me do a little bit of that. I think the idea here is if he immediately said, hey, stay the day, let me provide this great, amazing feast for you. We kind of do the same thing. If someone's offering so much, we say, no, that's too much trouble. Don't worry about it. So he's trying to get them to stay, offering them just a little. And then notice what happens when they agree to stay. Then he over delivers. I mean, he prepares this big feast, not a bit of bread, but 3 measures of bread, which would have been a ton, probably enough for them to take with them afterwards. So this was just Abraham going above and beyond, showing his neighbors, his friends here, or not even his friends, just these strangers, just the hospitality that they deserve as people.
Right. If I can interject right here, I want to note what Ward says in his commentary on this text, because what he does is he recognizes the importance of hospitality within the culture of Abraham's day. He notes that hospitality was viewed far differently than it is now, rather than an inconvenience, which just real fast, Alan, what would you do if 3 random people showed up on your doorstep right now? Number one, would you, or Melanie especially, would she even make eye contact?
She wouldn't even want me to answer the door,
exactly,
probably. So.
Yeah, that just wouldn't happen. Their idea of hospitality is so different than our idea of hospitality. And Nathan really makes that point here. He says, but rather than it being an inconvenience, it was viewed as a privilege. It was viewed as a privilege. Rather than inviting the men in because he felt compelled, Abraham almost begs for the honor of providing for these strangers, extending hospitality, as the subsequent contrasting episode in Sodom indicates, is the primary act of civilized intercourse. So there are these 2 contrasting ideas here of hospitality. Here in Genesis 18, we have hospitality being shown very lovingly. Here, let me serve you. Let me take care of you. Let me provide for your needs. And it is kind of funny that Abraham does the little bait and switch here. He says, here, I'll give you a little bit, gets them to stay, and then boom, I'll give you the full course meal. And whereas we get to Genesis 19, what we're going to see is the hospitality is not, hey, what can I do for you? It's, hey, what can you do for me? How can I take advantage of you for myself? And
Abraham here at the end of verse 8, he literally serves them. I mean,
yes.
He says he served them as they ate.
Super interesting.
I mean, he's acting as the waiter to them, basically.
And how often would you see this for the great patriarch of the family being the one who would serve guests? That's just not normally how it would happen. We've already discussed in past episodes how vast Abraham's wealth was and how great his household was. It was not the fact that there were no servants. There certainly were. But Abraham felt compelled to serve these men in this way. I want to note, too, that there are 3 men here. There are 3 men who are indicated, yet it shows Abraham talking to, really interacting with just one of them, referring to the one as my Lord. This would probably lead us to understand that there was probably a predominant figure in this small group of men. That probably the way this happened is that the leader, which we're going to see, the leader's God. This is Yahweh in human flesh, human body here. And then his 2 angels, that more than likely the leader would be sitting in the forefront with the 2 servants kind of behind him in kind of subjugated type positions. So and that's just, again, looking at cultures, that's how it worked during this time. You would have the predominant figure in the front with those who were lesser in the back. And so we have him sitting down here in this text, and we have them enjoying, or we have Abraham preparing this great meal for them to enjoy. And as this is going on, as this meal takes place, they begin to have conversation. And it's at this point that we can probably assume with certainty, with some confidence, that Abraham recognizes, well, these aren't just regular people. There's a little more going on here. Because the first thing we see is them asking in verse number 9, well, where is your wife Sarah? They asked him, they asked Abraham. And Abraham says, there in the tent. And the Lord said, verse number 10, I will certainly come back to you in about a year's time, and your wife Sarah will have a son. And now Sarah was listening in the entrance of the tent behind him. Abraham and Sarah were old and getting on in years. Sarah had passed the age of childbearing, so she laughed to herself. After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I have delight? But the Lord asked Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Saying, can I really have a baby when I'm old? Is anything impossible for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will come back to you. In about a year, she will have a son. But Sarah denied it. I did not laugh, she said, because she was afraid. But he replied, no, you did laugh. It's a little bit of comedy here, just because we have probably all been in this situation where somebody has done something, we call them on it, like, oh, no, I didn't. They're like, yes, you did. You did do that. And that's what happens here in this text, is that as the Lord speaks up and gives this prophecy of what's going to take place, which narrows down now the promises that he had made, that had been made to Abraham. First it was, you'll have a great nation. And we know the runaround that Abraham had trying to figure out how this would take place, whether it be through Lot, whether it be through the son of Hagar. Then finally the Lord gives them more detail. No, it's going to come through you and your wife Sarah, and it's going to be a son. His name's going to be Isaac. Now we have a time frame, because from the point that we find him in chapter 12, which what we say was about 20, he was 75 years old at that time, to where we are now, he's almost 100. We have 25 years that have passed, and we finally have some concrete, this is the time. What I have promised you is finally going to come to fruition. Alan, what do you think? What do you make of the laughing that Sarah gives in response to what is said here?
I think there's obviously it's supposed to play off what happens in chapter 17. This isn't the first time that God has said this, that Abraham's going to have a son, and somebody laughed about it. The first time was Abraham. He fell down on his face and pretty much said the same thing. You know, I'm 100 years old. Sarah's 99. How can she give birth? In chapter 17 and verse 17. But in verse 19 of chapter 17, God said, no, your wife Sarah will bear you a son. So very, very specific, not just that Abram will have a son, but it'll be by Sarah. Sarah will have the son. We'll give birth to Isaac. We have his name there. Now that chapter was a conversation between God and Abraham. We don't know if Sarah was there or not. I have a hard time thinking that Sarah or that Abraham didn't relay this to Sarah.
You would think that. I mean, we know that us husbands are not always great at communication, at sharing stuff with our wives. I'm pretty sure this would be a conversation that Abraham would definitely make sure he had with Sarah to let her know, hey, we're gonna have a son, and we even know what his name's going to be. I think that would have come up at least in small talk at some point.
So if that's the case, if Sarah knew about what happened in chapter 17, well, here it's being addressed again. Okay, Sarah's going to have a son, and that kind of gives us a clue what this laughter meant. I mean, she still was unbelieving. She could not believe that would happen to her. Someone, as she mentioned, I'm past childbearing years. I'm worn out. They're getting old. She just can't believe. She can't get to a point of belief at that statement yet. And she laughs, and clearly it's a laughter of doubt, because when God asks her about that, the Lord said, why did you laugh? She denies it. She's a little nervous. She said, oh, I didn't laugh. if she was just laughing out of joy, then why would she deny it? She wouldn't be ashamed of it. So I think she was. I think this is clearly an example of just her level of faith just not being there quite yet. It will be eventually when all of this comes to pass, but she's not to the same level I think Abraham is in terms of faith in God's promises.
Right, and I think that verses 13 and 14 might be an invitation that the Lord has given to Abraham to, hey, you need to talk to your wife, you need to convince her that this is not something that is beyond my ability. Verse 13, but the Lord said to Abraham. So this conversation is taking place between the Lord and Abraham at this moment. Though Sarah's in the tent doing what she's doing with the skeptical laughing, the Lord says to Abraham, Sarah's laughing and she's saying, can I really have a baby when I'm old? Then he says, is there anything impossible for the Lord? Abraham, you know that. You know that there's nothing that is impossible to me. You need to make sure that your wife understands that. You need to get her on board and help her to understand that. And this is not beyond my ability. That I have given you this promise, and this is the way that I'm going to fulfill this promise. Abraham, help your wife to believe. Help her to understand. And that really is the role of the husband in leading our wives, helping them to have great faith and have great understanding and trust in the Lord. That's something that we see as a failure on Adam's part back in the garden. And, hey, Alan, take out your headphones real fast. Sandra's saying there's static in the background.
A lot of static, okay. Let's switch here.
Put them back on. Let's see here.
Any better now?
Yeah, can you hear me, Alan?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, yeah, I think we're good. Yeah, I do not hear myself now. I think we'll see what Sandra says to make sure we're good to go. Sandra, if you could give us a comment, make sure that has been resolved now. Thanks for letting us know. Yeah. But back in the garden in Genesis 3, Adam didn't do his job well in leading his wife and keeping her faith high and her trust in the Lord where it needed to be. And here, at least to me, it might be a little bit of an invitation from the Lord to Abraham to help your wife get to where she needs to be, help her to have the faith that she needs to have. All right, Sandra says we're good to go. Sweet.
There's another interesting tie into the New Testament here in verse 14. Of course, this whole thing is, think of another time in the New Testament when someone that is beyond childbearing years is predicted to have a child. Well, I think of the mother and father of John the Baptist.
Right.
And it's interesting, verse 14 of Genesis chapter 18, is anything impossible for the Lord? You get the exact same phrase in Luke chapter 1 and verse 37, where nothing will be impossible with God. So I think you're supposed to see some connections later on with John the Baptist there as well. Just, older parents that don't believe that, or can't believe that they can have a child, and, nothing's impossible with the Lord.
Absolutely. And especially whenever it comes to bringing about his promises, that if the Lord has made a promise, he is going to do everything necessary to bring it about. And John the Baptist was a part of God's promises through the prophet Isaiah, that there would be a voice crying out in the wilderness, preparing the way of the Lord. And John the Baptist was going to fulfill that role. These were the parents that he was going to come through. And if that's the promise the Lord had made, he was going to make sure that his promise would be fulfilled, even if it was done in a way that would not, to our understanding, be possible or be the easiest way for it to be carried out.
Yep.
So, Alan, after this conversation and this interaction takes place between these three visitors, which we believe to be identified as the Lord and two of his angels, the men get up, beginning in verse 16. The text tells us in Genesis chapter 18 and verse 16, the men got up from there and looked out over Sodom, and Abraham was walking with them to see them off. You can basically see him walking with them off of his property, so to say, helping them on their way. And the Lord said, should I hide what I'm about to do from Abraham? So there's this, now we have, best I could tell, an internal discussion that's taking place within the Lord, that he is thinking to himself, as he's looking over at Sodom. We're going to see what he has been hearing from Sodom. And he has this conversation, should I hide what I'm about to do from Abraham? Abraham is to become a very great and powerful nation, verse 18, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him. That is referring back to the original promises, Genesis 12 and verse 3. For I have chosen him so that he will command his children and his house after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. This is how the Lord will fulfill to Abraham what he promised him. Then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is immense, and their sin is extremely serious. I will go down and see if what they have done justifies the cry that has come up to me. If not, I will find out. So there's this outcry that the Lord indicates has been coming from Sodom and Gomorrah. There's the shrieking of torment from the oppressed. These people who have been unjustly harmed by what is taking place in Sodom and Gomorrah. We're going to see some evidence of that in Genesis chapter 19. And the Lord here, it isn't that the Lord is not sure what is going to happen or what has taken place. And it's not as if he's having to come down to know. He already knows. But he's going to send his angels. We're going to see in the next chapter, he's going to send them to go really get into the environment and to have a witness to what is taking place and to what is going to take place here in Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19. So verse 22, Alan, you want to pick up there and then now talk about the actual conversation that takes place between Abraham and the Lord concerning Sodom and Gomorrah?
So yeah, starting in verse 22, you start to a pretty famous passage of Abraham basically interceding for Sodom, and it almost sounds like a negotiation between himself and God.
Yeah.
Verse 22, the men turned from there and went toward Sodom, while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Abraham stepped forward and said, will you really sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away instead of sparing the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people who are in it? You could not possibly do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. You could not possibly do that. Won't the judge of the whole earth do what is just? The Lord said, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Then Abraham answered, since I have ventured to speak to my Lord, even though I am dust and ashes, suppose the 50 righteous lack 5. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? He replied, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. Then he spoke to him again, suppose 40 are found there. He answered, I will not do it on account of 40. Then he said, let my Lord not be angry, I will speak further. Suppose 30 are found there. He answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. Then he said, since I have ventured to speak to my Lord, suppose 20 are found there. He replied, I will not destroy it on account of 20. Then he said, let my Lord not be angry, and I will speak one more time. Suppose 10 are found there. He answered, I will not destroy it on account of 10. When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he departed, and Abraham returned to his place.
All right, Alan, so is this Abraham dictating to the Lord what the Lord is going to do? Is that what's taking place here? Because there are some who would say that this is the Lord being negotiated with. This is him being influenced. That this is, somebody even say that this is Abraham manipulating the Lord to some degree. Is that the case?
Yes and no. No, in the sense that God can be manipulated. I don't think there was anything that Abraham could have said to change the Lord's intentions of doing good and doing just. But notice what the Lord had just said early on. Should I hide what I'm about to do from Abraham? Abraham is to become a great and powerful nation. All these phrases, I've chosen him. He's saying why he's going to include Abraham in this investigation, in this judgment. Right. So I think he's calling on Abraham to be a blessing to the world around him, to intercede. So I think this is exactly what the Lord was hoping to see from Abraham.
Right.
So, and the Lord, every time, he never says like, okay, I'm getting tired of all these numbers. Every time he says, yes, I'll do it for 40. I'll do it for 30. I'll do it for 20. He can see, obviously he knows what Abraham's heart is. So Abraham is appealing to God's love right here. He knows that Sodom and Gomorrah are worthy of being destroyed. So he's not appealing to the justness of God, the righteousness. He's appealing to God's mercy and love to spare the whole city just on account of 50, 40, 30, even 10. And you kind of wonder, okay, why didn't he just keep going? At some point, I think even Abraham realizes, like, okay, if not even 10 people can be found righteous in the city of Sodom, then, what's the point? At some point, it's just too much. There's too much wicked. There's too much. And I think really he's obviously thinking about Lot in this instance. And obviously God understands that as well. So he's thinking, okay, if I can try to spare the city on Lot's account, and the fact that there weren't even 10 people in the city speaks volumes about, Lot and his family. And I think God understood that. And that's why we see later on Lot being pulled away from the city and rescued, because of I think that was Abraham's goal here with that.
Right. And you're thinking, how many are there included in his nephew's family? Maybe he knows at this point that Lot is within this city, and that, say, he has 10 people within his family. Maybe he's working on the precedent of what happened with the flood, that there were only 8 righteous in the world, and the 8 was not enough to spare the entire world. So maybe he said, the Lord's not going to spare the world on account of 8. He's not going to spare it on account of even less than 10 either. So we're going to stop here at this number. We're just not really sure exactly what is the case, but I agree wholeheartedly what you're saying. Abraham knows the Lord's mercy. He knows the grace that he is capable of providing to a people. Abraham himself has been a recipient of God's grace on a number of occasions up to this point, just being chosen. The fact that he was chosen to be the man through whose family these incredible promises would be given shows God's mercy, and Abraham is going to work on that behalf. And he has this conversation. This conversation gets all the way down to 10, and they separate and go their ways. And it brings us then to Genesis chapter 19, which this
also highlights just God's nature.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to see these chapters, and just think about God destroying a city,
mm-hmm.
and that's all we focus on. Well, notice, Sodom and Gomorrah is notorious in the Bible for being pretty much the most wicked cities ever.
Right.
And yet,
yes,
over and over again, we see God wanting to spare the city for 50, for 40, for 10. He wants to spare. He does not want to destroy. Even for the smallest little reason, he will not destroy, even if they are completely wicked like they are, and deserving of what comes to them. God is searching for every opportunity, chance to show mercy. But at some point, justice has to be done. There has to be justice. There has to be consequences for sin as well. But he's definitely searching for that opportunity to spare.
Now, so what jumps off the page to me, at least in chapter 19, is verse 16. As this is all going on, we're going to get to this, but just to add some meat to what you're saying about the mercy and compassion of God, Job wasn't exactly working well with the angels at this point while this whole episode is going on in Genesis 19. He's hesitating multiple times. He does not want to leave. He is not understanding exactly what is taking place. And in verse 16 of chapter 19, the text says that he hesitated, but because of the Lord's compassion for him.
Mm-hmm.
So here it is. Even in the midst of this occasion where God's justice is on full display, where his wrath against wickedness and sin is clearly seen in the fact that he destroyed not just 2 cities, but this entire plain full of cities because of the wickedness that was found therein. His compassion is still seen on this man Lot and his family, in the fact that he's going to give them an opportunity to to be spared from what is taking place. So, without me talking too much more, getting way too far ahead of ourselves, Alan, I'm going to read just a few verses here, and then we're going to discuss what takes place here at the beginning of this chapter. So, we're in Genesis 19 now, beginning in verse 1. I'm sorry I did not scroll down the page with you guys are reading, but Genesis 19 and verse 1. The two angels entered Sodom. So we go here from three individuals that are mentioned at the beginning of chapter 18 who come to Abraham. They interact with Abraham. As they're walking away, Abraham is having a discussion with the Lord and the predominant figure. At the end of chapter 18, it says that the Lord departs, and while the Lord might have departed, it seems that his angels, the remaining two people of this group of three, they continue on their way and they enter into Sodom in the evening, verse number 1 of chapter 19, as Lot was sitting in Sodom's gateway. And when Lot saw them, he got up to meet them. He bowed with his face to the ground and said, "My lords, turn aside to your servant's house, wash your feet, and spend the night, and then you can get up early and go on your way." "No," they said, "we would rather spend the night in the square." But he urged them so strongly that they followed him and went into his house. He prepared a feast and baked unleavened bread for them, and they ate. If you're reading chapters 18 and 19 straight in a row, you're going to see a number of similarities here between what takes place at the beginning of chapter 18 and what takes place beginning of chapter 19. Alan, what do you see as the similarities here within those two opening texts of these chapters?
Well, obviously you have the same two angels that were at the beginning in chapter 18, and now they're in chapter 19. But you have two different hosts here, in Abraham in chapter 18, and now Lot is the one that is hosting these angels, and their treatment is the same. Notice he bows down just as Abraham bowed down at the beginning of chapter 18, and then he washes their feet, he welcomes them into their home, prepares a feast, and bakes unleavened bread for them in chapter 19, verse 3. So I think you're supposed to see the connections of righteousness between Lot and Abraham, and how they treat these visitors. That is the way that people are to be treated. That is righteousness and hospitality and loving your neighbor personified right here. And then, of course, the contrast between Lot and Abraham is going to be how the men of Sodom treat the two angels later on.
Right, and what else might you add, Alan, specifically about where we find Lot in this instance? The text tells us that in the evening, whenever they come into Sodom, they find Lot sitting in Sodom's gateway. I think we might see the end kind of a progression that took place in regards to Lot's relationship with Sodom. You want to speak to that for just a moment?
We first see when him and Abram separate back in chapter 12, that he pitches his tent toward Sodom. So he heads in that direction. And then just a chapter later, when Lot is captured in war, it says he was living in the city of Sodom. So he's not just near Sodom, now he's moved into Sodom. And at this point, he's still, it's kind of interesting to note, what happened previously, he was taken in war and taken out of Sodom. Well, he still comes back to Sodom, and he's still there. And at this point, it seems like he's a prominent member of the society there. Right. And you standing at the gate, that was usually the place of judgment of, the leaders of the city, the council. That's where they would meet, at the gate. So he seems to be either in a leadership position or at least in some kind of authority or prominence within the city. So moving from a stranger all the way to someone who maybe even passed judgment on others.
Right, some sort of position of influence he has, or at least some sort of influence, some degree of influence he has in this city. And we're going to see that he tries to exercise that in the following verses. Verse number 4, after they've gone into the home of Lot, we see that before they went to bed, the men of the city of Sodom, both young and old, the whole population surrounded the house, and they called out to Lot, and said, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Send them out so that we can have sex with them." But Lot went out to them at the entrance and shut the door behind him. He said, "Don't do this evil, my brothers. Look, I've got 2 daughters who haven't been intimate with a man. I'll bring them out to you. You can do whatever you want to them. However, don't do anything to these men, because they have come under the protection of my roof." Wow. So there's a saying that wow, that escalated quickly. Things, there was a cry that the text in Genesis chapter 18 and verse number 20 says, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is immense, and their sin is extremely serious. It does not take even a full day of the Lord's angels being in Sodom for them to see this extreme wickedness and evil firsthand. That the men, the text is very, very plain here, that all the men, that the entire population of men within this city, from the youngest to the oldest, it says, are coming to do serious harm to these men who have visited this city. And we have here Lot then defending these men. So he isn't seemingly in a position of influence, and he's going to try to use his influence to not have something bad done to these men. And then he does something that might catch us off guard, because we're seeing something difficult here with Lot. So as you mentioned, it is clearly seen that he is making a progression to being assimilated into Sodom, to being within this Sodom environment. But yet at the same time, whenever we look at a place like 2 Peter 2 and verse 7, the text says there, Peter refers to Lot as a righteous man during his time in Sodom. And yet we have those two things, and then we throw on top of that what he does here in offering up his daughters, his two virgin daughters, who he wants to give to the men instead of give to the men of the city, instead of allow his guests to be taken by the men of the city. Alan, help me. You're a smart man. Help me make some sense of this text, because it's difficult to understand.
It's definitely difficult, and there could be several things happening. One, he might just be trying to throw him off the scent, just trying to distract him in some way with the daughter's idea. I tend to think this is partially a little bit of just the influence of being in such a wicked city, that maybe he thinks that this is, if not okay, then a better option than allowing those two men and just giving them up. His priorities have changed. He believes that his role as host and his role being hospitable to these strangers is more important than his role as a protective father or something. I think there might be a parallel. I think of Jephthah. Remember, he made the vow to God to sacrifice whatever came out the door, and it was his daughter. So he kind of had a choice: do I keep my vow or do I sacrifice my daughter? And it never says which one is right or wrong. It was, and to me, I think he did sacrifice the daughter. So his priorities were keeping his vow above human sacrifice. That was his mindset, that was right. More important to keep. And same thing here. I think Lot's just his priorities, doing what is more right is just completely skewed here. Just the wicked influence of the city around him is just, and he's in a bad position. And at some point, from our own mistakes, our own bad judgments, we're going to be in a position where we have to choose between two evils, basically. And neither of them is good. There's not one that's better than the other. They're both terrible, and we just have to blame our own selves for getting us in that position in the first place.
Yeah, it seems to me that Lot, first of all, finds himself in this situation because he has decided to live in a place that is known for its evil. I mentioned in our last study that even if we are in an evil environment, and even if we are able to not be influenced ourselves to live wickedly, at some point we are going to suffer the consequences of other people's wickedness. Mm-hmm. And that's what we see here in this text. We see him suffering the consequences of other people's wickedness. He's trying to do what is the right thing. And you hear the arguments from people who don't appreciate the Bible's strong stance against homosexuality, the action of homosexual relationships. And they would say, well, the real problem here was hospitality. And yes, there is that problem here. The men of Sodom are not treating these guests with proper hospitality, as we have seen in the previous verse, or its previous chapter, where Abraham was seeking to serve. Here they are seeking to take advantage.
Mm-hmm.
But the issue is also, how are they seeking to take advantage of them? Through these homosexual actions. So both of those wrongs are present here. And the lack of hospitality does not negate the other. But at the same time, I'm looking at it from Lot's standpoint. I'm thinking, well, maybe as you're talking about here, there's neither one of these options are good. If it is truly a dichotomy where you have two options, it's either give them my guest or give them my virgin daughters. Lot's sitting here thinking, well, which one's worse? And it seems to be in his mind, he has determined that the greater sin would be to break the hospitality rules of their culture. That it would be worse for me to give up these men who have come under the protection of my home, to give them up to be ravaged by this mob. It would be the lesser sin for me to give up my virgin daughters. But the reality is that it is not a true dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy. Those were not the only two issues. He could have just bunkered down and done nothing. At least that's what you would think would have been the case. But instead, what the text tells us is that as he's going about trying to bring some sort of resolution in verses 8 and 9, verse 8 and then verse 9, they say, get out of the way. This one came here as an alien, speaking of Lot, but he's acting like a judge. Where he might have come into Sodom and been accepted while he was playing by the rules, now that he's going against what is expected, well, now he's going to be rebuked for that. He's acting like a judge. Now, we'll do more harm to you than them. And they put pressure on Lot and came up to break down the door, but the angels reached out, brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door, and they struck them in, were at the entrance of the house, both young and old, with blindness. Altar says there was some sort of blinding light that came out, so they were unable to find the entrance. So here's the deliverance. Here's the mercy seen on behalf of God, that as as Lot sticks up for the men, and the harm now is shifted from the men to him, that the angels reach in, they pull Lot into the house, and they strike them with blindness so they cannot see. I'll tell you, Alan, if you're reading this for the first time, you're wondering, how in the world is this going to turn out? Because by what we probably guess, they're stuck at this point. There's nothing that they can do.
I like that it mentions that the angels shut the door behind him. And that makes me think about when Noah went onto the ark.
Oh, that's good. I like that.
God shut the door of the ark and separated the righteous from the wicked of the world. So the only way they're getting out of this is with God's help and protection. And that's what he does. He shuts the door, and that's what he's doing in this whole chapter. He's separating out the righteous from the wicked, and then punishing the wicked.
Yeah, in verse number 12, then now like I said, they're kind of stuck, it seems, at this point. They have done what they can to protect Lot, to bring him in, to shut the door behind him. And now it is full-out rescue mode. What can we do to escape the judgment that is about to come? Verse number 12 says, the angel said to Lot, do you have anyone else here? A son-in-law, your sons and daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of this place, for we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against this people is so great before the Lord that the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So we can tie that in with what was said in chapter 18 and verse 21, that the Lord says, I will go down to see if what they have done justifies the cry that is coming to me. If not, I will find out. Well, certainly he has found out. He has determined that it is just as advertised. The whole city is depraved to the greatest degrees. So Lot, verse 14, went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who were going to marry his daughters. And he said, get up, he said, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city. But his sons-in-law thought he was joking. A couple of things here. Alter draws a distinction here. He says that in his understanding of Hebrew language, that there should be a difference between this verse and the previous verses that are talking about sons-in-laws and sons. In his estimation, what he believes is the case is that Lot has more than just the daughters that were currently in his house. They had other daughters that were already married. So with the way the CSB renders it, the sons-in-law who were going to marry his daughters, he understands that instead as sons-in-laws who had married his other daughters. So Lot's got other family members in other places, it seems, in Sodom or something of that nature. Because what we're going to see is that the only people who make it out of the city are going to be Lot, his wife, and 2 daughters, along with the angels. So at least the way Alter understands it is that Lot did lose some family members in the destruction of this city, if I understand what he was writing correctly. But I want to note there in 14 the sons-in-law's reactions. That they thought he was joking. To me, it's the same. It's a similar reaction to what we see with Sarah in the previous chapter. One being a blessing. She laughs at the blessing, doesn't believe in the blessing. And here, these people laugh at the curses. They don't believe that that's actually going to take place. I don't know what you think.
Well, I want to know where these sons-in-law were. Because remember, it said all the men of Sodom, both young and old, the whole population had surrounded the house.
That's right.
So
yeah, that might be true.
Are they part of this mob that was going to, trying to attack the angels? I would assume probably. I mean, I'm sure these sons were people of men of Sodom. They were born there, lived there, so they're just as wicked as any of the others. And clearly, yes, I mean, like you said, they're laughing. They don't have any sort of idea or any sort of belief that what Lot says is true. So it's interesting to see the level of influence that Lot have. We tend to think, okay, if we were to go maybe live somewhere where there was a lot of wicked people, we think of ourselves as being a light in those types of instances. And yes, Lot was righteous, but look at the influence he had. He's losing even family members to wickedness. He's not really. I mean, at some point you have to just cut and run and get out of there, because he's not a light to this city at all. It's just getting worse and worse, and it's seeping into his family.
Right. So we pick up then in verse 15, that at daybreak, after Lot has had these conversations with his family members, trying to warn them about what's going to take place. Verse number 15, at daybreak the angels urged Lot, saying, "Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you'll be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he hesitated. Because of the Lord's compassion for him, the men grabbed his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters, and they brought him out and left him outside the city. As soon as the angels got them outside, one of them said, "Run for your lives, and don't look back, and don't stop anywhere on the plain. Run to the mountains, or you will be swept away." But Lot said, "No, my lords, please. Your servant has indeed found favor with you, and you have shown me great kindness by saving my life. But I can't run to the mountains. The disaster will overtake me, and I will die. Look, this city is close enough for me to flee to. It is a small place. Please let me run to it. It's only a small place, isn't it? So that I can survive." And he said, being the angel he's speaking to, he said, "All right, I will grant your request about this matter too, and will not demolish the town you mentioned. Hurry up and run to it, for I cannot do anything until you get there. Therefore the name of the city is Zoar." The sun had risen over the land when Lot reached Zoar, and then out of the sky the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah, burning sulfur from the Lord. He demolished these cities, the entire plain, all the inhabitants of the cities, and whatever grew on the ground. But Lot's wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. And early in the morning, Abraham went to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and all the land of the plain. He saw that the smoke was going up from the land like the smoke of a furnace. So it was, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham and brought Lot out of the middle of the upheaval when he demolished the cities where Lot had lived. So here brings the conclusion of the matter for Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities within this plain. After all this takes place, it is time to get gone. It's time for them to leave, verse number 15, at daybreak. It's time to leave, time to go. But Lot hesitates. And yet here's the compassion I brought up earlier, where the angels grab him. They literally take him by the hand, literally take his wife's hand, the hands of his daughters, and they drag him out of the city, and they tell him to go. And you would hope that at this point, Lot's going to say, okay, that's fine, we're gone. But instead, he doesn't exactly do that. Alan, what you think about his hesitation to go up into the mountains?
You just want to like smack Lot upside the face here.
Yeah.
The angels say, okay, run for your lives, don't look back, don't stop anywhere on the plain, run to the mountains. So what does Lot ask? He says, I don't want to run to the mountains. Let me go to this city that's on the plain, Zoar. So he'd rather. He's pretty presumptuous here to think they've just told him that they're going to destroy all these cities on the plain, and he doesn't want to leave the plain. And you understand, I think, the reaction that Lot's wife has, because Lot is almost the same. He just doesn't want to leave. He can't leave, and I think the only reason that he is spared is what it says in verse 29. You know, the God remembered Abraham and brought Lot out of the middle. So this was, I mean, I'm getting the sense that this was nothing to do with Lot, and this was everything to do with Abraham right here. The only reason Lot wasn't swept up in all of this, just based on, yes, he was considered a righteous man, but I mean, he was stuck with his head back in the city of Sodom, almost the same as his wife was too. But even because of the Lord's compassion, he flees to that one city, and that's got to be an interesting sight to be in the middle of the city, and all the other cities around you on the plain are getting destroyed, and I'm sure they could see it from there too. So that must have been a scary sight to be in Zoar and wondering why everyone else was getting fire and brimstone, but not you.
Yeah, just looking at and trying to figure out why. Why would Lot be hesitating so much? I mean, there are a number of factors that go into it. Maybe it was that he had family there still. Maybe that's the correct understanding of the text. Maybe it was, this was his home. This is where he had, to some degree, become a man who had influence within this place, which is why he was in the gate of the city. There are a number of factors for why he would look back at, and they're very human factors. They're things that I don't know if any of us have really much room to hate too much on him because of maybe we've been in those situations too where we don't want to leave because of family. We don't want to leave because there's value in that place because of where we've been. Yeah, if we go back to the beginning, was this the best place for him to be? No, it was not the best place for him to be. He looked at this place and he saw it because of its fertility, because of the opportunity and the ability that it gave him to have wealth of some sort. But at the end of the day, as the text says in 2 Peter, his righteous heart was tormented by everything that he saw. It just was not worth it. And we see him having to leave. And of course, the famous the famous portion of the story is his wife being turned into a pillar of salt, because she does end up turning back, and it seems that she had an even greater longing, an even greater desire for Sodom, and because of that.
Notice where Lot started when we first learn about him in chapter 11. In chapter 12, he's as wealthy, or just about as wealthy as Abraham.
Yes, this is good. Yeah,
and now notice what he has. He doesn't even have his wife anymore. All he has left in the world are his 2 daughters.
Right.
So I mean, he's gone from the top of the world to as low as you can go here.
Yeah, as you mentioned, he's left only with his 2 daughters, and they're not really in a good spot either. Let's see. Let's pick up here in the text, back in chapter 19, in verse 30. It says that Lot departed Zoar and lived in the mountains along with his 2 daughters because he was afraid to live in Zoar. Instead, he and his 2 daughters lived in a cave. So he pleads for this place. He pleads to be able to go there. Originally, the angel told him to go into the mountains. He says, no, I'd rather go into the city. He goes into the city, and now he's scared to live there. So he does end up going into the mountains, living in a cave of some sort. And here we just have another really sad occasion within his life, that the firstborn said to the younger, these are his 2 daughters, our father is old, and there is no man in the land to sleep with us, as is the custom of all the land. Come, let us get our father to drink wine so that we can sleep with him and preserve our father's line. So they got their father to drink wine that night, and the firstborn came and slept with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she got up. And the next day the firstborn said to the younger, Look, I slept with my father last night. Let's get him to drink wine again tonight so we can go sleep with him and we can preserve our father's line. That night they again got their father to drink wine, and the younger went and slept with him. He did not know when she lay down or when she got up. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The firstborn gave birth to a son named Moab. He is the father of the Moabites of today. And the younger also gave birth to a son, and she named him Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites of today. Whew, man! If things again, we think that things only get so bad, and yet here we see things going from bad to worse with this incestual relationships that take place between Lot and his daughters. But this is also an echo from a previous occasion that took place. Think about it from this perspective. Think about Lot and Noah and the similarities between them, that the Lord delivers both of them. They come out the other side, and then there's some alcohol involved, and there's some sexual immorality of some sort. Here's a second instance where whenever you get alcohol involved, bad things happen. And of course here, I mean, the desires of the daughters aren't bad desires. It's not bad that they want to carry on their father's line. That's an extremely important part of this culture. Yet the way they went about it, Alan, was the absolute wrong way. And what we have here are the results of what they have done. Because who end up being, or who do the Moabites and the Ammonites, what part do they play in the story of Abraham's people?
I think that's the key to this passage. You know, this seems pretty crazy, and obviously you see the influence that Sodom had on the lives of, or the mindsets of the daughters. That we tend to think of, you know, Sodom and Gomorrah as this, you know, wicked, but mainly from a homosexual standpoint. Well, they were just doing any sort of sexual sin they can think of there, I think, and that's why these two even came up with this idea. But I think the point in Scripture of why this story is there is to know the origins of these two nations, Moab and the Ammonites. And we'll see that those are two nations that come up a lot during the wilderness wanderings. The children of Israel have to pass through both of these nations on their way to Canaan, and they have issues with both of them, either fighting them or in the case of the Moabites, we have this instance, I believe it's Numbers
25.
Numbers 25,
right,
where they tempt the children of Israel into sinning greatly. Again, sexual sins happening there. The men of Israel were sleeping with some of the prostitutes from Moab, and there was a plague because of it.
Right.
So just some wickedness there. But I think a kind of a light at the end of the tunnel here, especially with Moab, who is the most famous Moabite that we know of later in Scripture.
Trick question, Moabitess.
That
would be Ruth, of course.
So we get an origin story here of the people of Moab, but it's not all, and the Moabites are pretty wicked throughout history, right. So we see why they are constantly judged or attacked or destroyed by the Israelites. But you also see that little ray of hope, because Ruth will come through Moab. So, and obviously we know that Ruth is of the Messianic line. She's an ancestor of Jesus. So that would actually make Lot an ancestor of Jesus, the same as Abraham.
Yeah, which is just crazy to think about, that Jesus, and if you just go through the genealogy of Jesus, you see a number of people who either themselves were not great people, or they were only around because of some mistakes made by other people. That to me is incredible. Yeah, but, I mean, just thinking about this text of Genesis, the text as a whole, as we're working through the story, it does seem odd for 19 to be here, because it gets away from Abraham, because it's all Abraham, beginning in chapter 12 and going through, what is it, chapter 22, 23, I guess, from 12 to 23. It's all Abraham. and all about his journey, his story. And then here's this random chapter about the destruction of this place. Well, why? Well, like you mentioned, it gives us some origins. It gives us history. It gives us the origin of the Moabite people. It also gives us a lesson in God's God's judgment of wickedness. And what would that serve for? Well, it would serve just as a lesson, an opportunity to teach a lesson to those who would be reading. So to me, that's important to highlight simply because that shows us that there's a reason for what is given within Scripture, even if it might seem somewhat odd. It doesn't really fit into the narrative because it does kind of shift away from Abraham, but it serves a good purpose, and it's good for us to try to highlight those purposes.
The key verse, I think, is chapter 18 and verse 19. It says, "For I have chosen him so that he will command his children," talking about Abraham, "and his house after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just." Well, how do we keep the way of the Lord? Well, one way is to know what will happen if we don't. And Sodom and Gomorrah is a perfect example of what happens when we don't keep that way. So it's on Abraham to pass on the commands, but also the warnings to his children. And here is an example, a good example of a warning that will come, and that he hopefully passed down to, he'll pass down to Isaac, and obviously it gets passed down through Moses and the generations. And the lesson of Sodom and Gomorrah will be used constantly throughout Scripture.
Yeah, that reminds me of a New Testament text for us, Romans 15, in verse number 4. "For whatever was written in the past was written for our instruction, so that we may have hope through endurance and through the encouragement from the Scriptures." That there are many lessons that are given to us in the Old Testament that help to teach us about the Lord and teach us about His ways, His character, and what He expects of us. And that's really what we have throughout this story, Sodom and Gomorrah. God takes sin seriously. If you didn't get it with the flood, that's the thing, if you didn't understand with the flood, where water poured from the sky and flooded the earth and destroyed it, then maybe you're going to get it here in Sodom and Gomorrah, where fire falls from the sky, and we see God's judgment against wickedness within this text. All right, Alan, that concludes our study today, Genesis 18 and 19. We're going to pick back up on Friday as we get into chapters 20, 21, and 22, looking at a few stories here, but culminating in the great showing of faith that Abraham has in chapter 22 with the episode of Isaac and offering him up as a sacrifice to the Lord. Alan, do you have any closing thoughts for our study today?
We didn't get a chance to talk about it, but if you get a chance, go look at Luke chapter 10, and it's when Jesus sends out the 72 disciples.
Ah, yes, that's good.
And consider some of the parallels with sending 2 men down to Sodom. And I think Sodom gets mentioned in Luke chapter 10. So we won't mention it, but we'll just let that be a little homework for you. Just look at that passage, how the men were supposed to go out and preach the gospel. And
hey, that's what we're doing right here. We're going 2 by 2 in our teaching.
There's 2 of us.
Hey, two is better than 1. That's what Ecclesiastes says. If we really want to be strong, we bring in a third person, but I don't quite know where that person would fit on the screen. So we're going to roll with just 2 for now. Alan, thank you so much for your teaching today. Thank you for your encouragement to our audience, and to our audience, thank you for joining us today as we continue to walk through his story, the history that is given to us of mankind, and the Lord's interaction with us through the book of Genesis. Hope you've been encouraged by what we talked about. Kind of a difficult text here. It's definitely not one of our favorite stories. Definitely not a children's bedtime story from the Bible, but it is an important lesson for us as we learn that we need to take the Lord and His holiness and righteousness seriously, and just avoid sin and temptation, difficult situations as best we can. Thank you for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of this day. Hope you'll join us again on Friday as we continue to walk through his story, Genesis 20 through 22. And if you don't have anyone that you're going to be able to study with tomorrow night, we invite you to join us here on the Pleasant Plains Facebook page at 6 o'clock as Austin Lewis leads us in a study through the book of Ezra. We'd love for you to join us then. Any opportunity you have to study God's Word with us, we invite you to. If you want to check out some of our past productions, you can do that here on the same tab, on the video tab. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. If you have any spiritual needs, we'd love to know about them. any way we can serve you, we would love to do so. Everybody take care. Have a great rest of your day. Hope you know that we love you. Most importantly, that God loves you. And may He bless you in all that you do. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. And we hope you'll join us here soon. Everybody take care. Have a great rest of your day.